Hi, I'm Allie Hamilton, and I'm so happy to welcome you to the Come As You Are podcast. Every week, we'll be talking about some aspect of healing, usually around childhood wounds and complicated familial relationships. The topics will always coincide with my personal essay of the week, and this will be a place where we can take a deep dive together. I'm so thrilled you've joined me and delighted for you to always come as you are. Hi there. Hi there. Welcome to our talk. This week, the topic is Tiny Stalker, Why We Tolerate Love That Hurts. And it's really about childhood wounds and how they can wreak havoc in our adult relationships if we don't wrangle them, if we don't understand what is happening. And sometimes, when you have conversations about sort of like reparenting yourself or, going back to childhood stuff, people can just really do I really have to go back to like things that happened when I was 4 to figure myself out? And I would say yes. You probably do at some point need to examine what happened. Your early childhood experiences have likely shaped you in ways that, you're going to want to explore. And it's pretty commonly accepted amongst, psychological, experts, if you will, that personality is formed in the first 5 years. But the first 10 years, if you think about, if you know any 10-year-olds or if you remember being 10, those first 10 years of life are you're just like a sponge. Obviously, like the first year, you're fully dependent on the people around you just to survive and thrive, hopefully. But after that, it's like you're just a sponge. And whatever's happening, these are your guides, right? Whomever your primary caregivers were, whether they were your biological parents or not, they were your guides. They kind of taught you about the world and about yourself and about the way things work and your place in the world and what the expectations were of you and the people around you. This is how you were absorbing information and making sense of where you were. And so some of the things that you might have learned in your family of origin may not be true, or maybe things that you sort of need to unlearn in order to be at peace later. And so I was writing in the personal essay this week about my experience with my mother in particular when I was really little, and my family of origin kind of imploded right before I turned 4. And I have very vivid memories of that time in my life because my grandmother, who I called Nanny, my mother's mother, she passed away. And I didn't, I was so little that sort of I heard my mother talking to my dad. I knew she was sick, but I didn't really know how sick she was, or I just didn't have any concept of that. And then she died. And the day that she died, I remember extremely well, because I wasn't allowed in her hotel room. I mean, her hospital room. She was not in a hotel. Hospital room. The end sort of happened swiftly. She had had a cold that she couldn't shake, and it turned out that it was breast cancer. But by the time they figured that out, it had moved to her lungs, and she didn't survive. And so she ended up in the hospital, and those last few days were just rapid decline. And that last day, I was there with my mom and my dad and my aunt and my uncle and my 4 cousins who I grew up with. And they all took turns walking me around the outside of the hospital throughout the day. And I just remember everyone crying. And my mother was not a crier. I really can count on one hand, and I don't even need the whole hand, the number of times I saw my mother cry in my life. And it was that day, it was the day her brother died. And there was one other day when we lost another family member, my cousin's little boy. So that's it. She just was not she was not someone who emoted. My mother was. She really did not like to have those uncomfortable conversations. She didn't see the value in therapy or therapeutic process. She was somebody who liked to avoid the things that were unpleasant and just make everything look nice. And I think it really, that tendency did her a real disservice, and all of us, because you can't really be close and work through things if you can't sit with uncomfortable feelings or face some things about yourself or hear other people when they're telling you that your behavior is causing them pain, or talk about things that might have happened in the past. If you can't do those things at all, then it really limits the level of intimacy that's available to anyone in your life. So that was my mother. And on top of it, she, with me in particular, just was not she just wasn't affectionate. She wasn't the kind of mom who was going to get on the floor and play with me or, read me books before bed. That just was not her. And part of it is that her life imploded when I was 4. She and my dad had been keeping up appearances for a year because my grandmother was so ill, and my mother did not want her mother to know that her marriage was in trouble and that she was heading toward divorce. She did not want her mother, who was her best friend, to be worrying about her or me or what was going to happen to us after she passed and my dad left. She just didn't want that added stress for her. So they were keeping up appearances very much for the whole family, not just my grandmother, but also my uncle, my aunt, my cousins. So my grandmother died, and my dad left the following week. And I remember that as well. I remember the day that my grandmother died and everyone crying and how I wasn't allowed in the hospital room and how I didn't understand what it meant that she was in heaven, and how I could get there to see her. I just didn't understand what was happening. And I watched Bewitched. And so I had this thought that maybe I could somehow get to a cloud up in heaven and sit there with her and talk to her, but I couldn't. I remember trying to work it out, how can I see her and where is she exactly? And the following week I woke up one day and my mother was sitting in our dining room by herself, which even just the image of my mother sitting was so unusual. She was always moving. She was just always cleaning and, moving and doing. And so I remember being really startled by that image of her sitting in a room by herself, quiet. There's nothing, she wasn't writing. She wasn't, she was just sitting there. And when I came in, she said, your dad isn't going to live here anymore. He's not going to be living with us anymore. He's going to have his own apartment nearby, and you'll go and visit him there once he's set up. And I remember not understanding because he hadn't said goodbye, and I just didn't think it was possible that he would have left without saying goodbye. And I went into their room and I went through I opened up all the drawers and I saw my dad's drawers are empty, and I opened the closet and all his things were gone. And I remember the shoehorns on the floor of the his closet, and he had left this robe, this red and blue very 70s robe. He and my mom had matching ones, and he had left his, and I thought, well, he'll have to come back for that, so that I remember all that pretty vividly. And what happened after, there's longer story. My mother, I think, was so distraught. She took me to a friend's house who I hadn't met ever outside the city. This woman had a farm. She lived there with her daughter and left me there for, I don't know how long. I don't know. It felt like a very long time. It could have been a weekend. It could have been a week. I don't know. I'll never know. Because it was one of the conversations I could never have with her. How long was I at that farm? She just wasn't somebody who was going to go back and talk about that kind of thing. So, but what I do remember is feeling like everyone had disappeared and I had no way to reach anyone. I didn't know how to reach my mom. I didn't know our phone number. I was 4. I didn't know how to reach my dad. I didn't even know where he was or if he knew where I was. I didn't know how to reach my aunt and uncle. I don't know why she didn't take me to my aunt and uncle's. I have to imagine she felt embarrassed to need the break. But, these are all questions I could never ask her. So in my little world, everyone disappeared all at once. I begged her not to leave me there. I remember chasing her car, and the woman that her friend picking me up and just watching the car disappear. And, I just remember all of it. So certainly I had a huge fear of abandonment for a long time in my life. And when my mother came back to get me and we went back into the city and back to our apartment and began sort of this new life together, I never had her. The experience that I had was, she was a single mom. She was 28 with a 4-year-old. Her mom had just died. Her dad died when she was 13. I think she felt ashamed that her marriage had ended. I think she didn't rely on my aunt and uncle the way that she could have and probably should have, because I was very close to them and comfortable. Not that I ended up going there and spending a lot of weekends there, but in that very beginning time, I don't think she leaned on them the way that probably would have been really helpful for all of us. And so my experience was that I suddenly started spending 3 nights a week at my mom's and 4 nights a week at my dad's, and he was already living with his girlfriend at the time, who became my stepmom eventually, but he was also seeing other people, so that was like that was not a good situation. And so I was spending 3 nights a week there, then I'd spend 4 nights a week with my mom, and then the next week they would alternate, so it would be 4 nights with my mom, 3 nights with my dad. But my mom was a little bit like on a mission to find a husband. And my mother, this is the 70s, and my mother's one of the smartest people, shrewd, really, really smart. She had gone to Catherine Gibbs secretarial school, and that's what she was trained to do. She's one of those people who she straight A student, but that was sort of like what, the women in her circle were doing at that time, was going to Catherine Gibbs, or so that's what she was doing. That's what she was trained to do. And so she got a job very quickly again as a secretary, and I was in preschool. I was 4. So what would happen is, like, preschool would end at 5. She would pick me up, and a lot of the time she'd have a date. And so I would basically get this 2 hours of time between 5 and 7 when she would go out the door. And it didn't matter if I just spent 4 nights at my dad's or 3 nights at my dad's. Very frequently, like the first night back at my mom's, she would have a plan. And that's another thing I couldn't ask her ever, is like, you had 3 or 4 nights a week to be dating. Like, did you really have to, go out so much when you had me? But that's the kind of question that would have, like, absolutely infuriated her. So my experience of that was I just never had her. I never had enough time with her. I was not her focus. She wasn't affectionate with me. Her sort of the most affectionate she was with me is like if we were walking back from preschool to the house, she would squeeze my hand a certain number of times, and I would try to keep track of how many times and squeeze her hand back. That was sort of like and we would like laugh. That was kind of the extent of the affection between us. She was not a hugger. She wasn't one to like put me on her lap, or that just wasn't her. And she wasn't one to sort of heap on verbal praise or say, I love you. Like, it just wasn't her style. And so there was a dearth of feeling and time and attention and interest coming from her that I really wanted. But I think now, this is someone who's 28, single mom in New York City, trying to like make it work, keep a roof over our heads. And I think her only sort of big plan was to find another husband to give us some security. I think that's what she thought was her best option. And so she was on a mission. And so what ended up happening for me is just those 2 hours were so fraught, because I wanted so much more. And I knew that if I expressed that, I'd get in trouble or she'd get angry and it would ruin the little bit of time that I had with her. So I would spend a lot of the time trying to force my feelings down and just take what I could get, and make it fun so that, like, at least she wasn't getting annoyed with me, or I wasn't bringing her down or making things harder. And so what that would look like is whatever the 15 minutes walking home, then she would basically get right into the shower. My mother was not a person who was like comfortable with nudity or nakedness, and so I was not allowed to be in the bathroom while she was showering. So I'd sit on the floor outside her bathroom door in her bedroom and just wait. And then once she was like dry and she had a bra and slip on, then she would open the bathroom door, and then I was allowed to like watch her put her makeup on and watch her blow dry her hair. And if she was in a good mood, she might let me put on one of her dresses and a pair of her heels and kind of clomp around, the living room. But a lot of the time she was not in the mood for that. So it was just like I could just sit there and sort of watch her. And I mean, I adored her, but I was sort of like desperate for her love and her attention and her approval and her affection. And it was very much like that unrequited love kind of feeling, but for your mom, so it was rough. And then the bell would ring at a certain point and it would be the sitter. And I would feel instantly like I'd want to start crying, and I would fight that because I knew it would enrage her or upset her or disappoint her. And so the sitter would come, and then there was a very big expectation, even at 4, 5, 6, that I was going to be polite and make the sitter feel like I was happy to see her. And so it was a lot of that kind of thing going on, where I was wrangling these huge emotions in a little body, trying not to want what I wanted or trying not to show what I wanted, certainly trying not to say what I wanted, which was for her not to go out. And usually that is where it would get really hard for me to not cry. And she would get really frustrated. She would get, if I couldn't sort of keep it together, she would get frustrated. And if that didn't sort of like make me swallow all that stuff down, then she'd get angry, and then I would absolutely just like force it down. But that is what I was learning, is really learning, okay, if you have big, uncomfortable feelings, like you've got to push those down. And the sitter's feelings are more important. The stranger you don't know that she's going out with is more important. It's like prioritized more. So it was rough, and that stayed with me. And that is all of us, and that's, I think, a kind of extreme example, but even the smaller things that happen to all of us, like not getting invited to a party, or, feeling like, I don't know, like your friends are whispering and you're not included, or all that stuff that we go through as kids. It really does, especially those first 10 years. It's really it just seeps in there, and it really affects your sense of self. And depending on what else is happening in your life, if you have a really secure, happy home life, maybe those things affect you a little bit less, like your self-esteem is you're a little more resilient, but maybe not. And so chances are, no matter who you are or what kind of childhood you had, what kind of parents you had, what kind of family of origin you had, chances are somewhere along the way in those first 10 years you had some experiences that hurt, that were painful or confusing or scary. And that stuff stays with us. And that's the stuff. Like if you're having a day today as a grown-up, where you're feeling a little like, social media, right? You're scrolling along and maybe something amazing has happened for someone that or an acquaintance or whatever, and it's like great, and the feeling that you have inside is like, ugh, not pretty, like why not me? Or like, did they just take up my place in the sun? Or like you can't be happy for them. That's such a bad feeling. We all know what I'm talking about. It's a bad feeling when you can't be happy for someone. And when that happens for me, I always check myself. Okay, like where, like I kind of know the little kid in me is having a moment. You know, that 4 year old, 5 year old, 8 year old me is having a moment of like insecurity or feeling less than or not good enough or whatever it is, you know, not lovable, unworthy, broken at my core. All that stuff that I sort of grew up believing as a kid is somehow rising to the surface, and it's leading to kind of petty, small thinking. And once I check in and kind of, okay, what's going on here? Like, there is no one can take your place in the sun, you know. Like, that's not, at this point in my life, I'm really clear on that. It's like, you know, each one of us is unique. And I mean, 7-8 billion people on this planet, but like only one of each one of us, right? Only one. And in all of time, it's like you've never happened before, and you are never going to happen again. You specifically, like whatever your name is, you know, that's it. Like we only get one of you. And so no one can take your place in the sun. And the sun's going to shine whether any of us are here or not. And you know, there's enough to go around. Like, there's nothing to worry about. And you have a unique perspective and unique gifts to share because only you have had the life that you've had. It might be similar to other people's, but you're still going to express yourself in a unique way. Whatever you do, in whatever, you know, ways that you express yourself, it's yours. And that's what makes each one of us interesting, right? Like I love the people in my life. I am endlessly fascinated by human beings and their quirks and their fears and their, you know, insecurities and their joys and their gifts. Like I find it so fascinating to understand how someone thinks about things, why they think the way that they do. You know, learning, like thinking about something in a different way myself. It's one of the reasons for me I love great writing. Like I just have been reading my whole life, and it's been such a source of comfort and learning and growth and understanding and insight. But they're all, any art, right? Like if you're watching a great film and you see someone expressing something, that's why, I mean, I cry. It's like almost a joke in my family. Like if someone starts crying on screen, I'm like almost instantly crying. You know, that's everyone. We have mirror neurons. Now, you know, sometimes life hardens you and that stuff gets a little bit like buried, but mirror neurons is like, we're literally wired for empathy. And that's why if you're watching something or you're reading something, I used to read Harry Potter to my kids. Those were in the before days, before whatever. But when my kids were tiny, I used to read to them for like an hour a night. I loved reading books that just kind of got their imaginations, you know, moving and swirling. And they would laugh because I would cry at like the, you know, the emotional parts. Like I would start crying. I would have to stop reading for a minute to like gather myself. So, and I used to feel like funny about that, you know, I used to feel like, but now I'm just like, no, I think that's good. I don't know. I think life, if you let it, it's going to soften you and open you. And like crying is good. And, you know, whether you're crying out of joy or you're crying out of sorrow, like, I think a huge part of the problem for so many people is editing out their feelings. And I think because I did that for so much of my childhood, I've now gone all the way to the other extreme. So if I'm joyful, I'm like extremely joyful. And if I'm sad, still to this day, like I'm really going to experience that sorrow. Or if I'm grieving or if I'm excited, you know, whatever it is, I'm going to really be in that. And I'd much rather be that way. You know, it's like, it's free. You're free. And I think the kid version of me is pretty happy these days, but it's because I spent the last 30 years working on this stuff. You know, it's not like I think most people have some work to do to kind of free themselves up again and to understand what's driving them or what's, you know, stopping them. And what ended up happening for me, and I'll just go back now to like my 20s, is I had this experience, and there was a whole bunch of other, like there's another circus going on at my dad's, which certainly affected my self-esteem and my sense of like my role in this world. And, you know, there was a lot of caretaking going on for my dad, tremendous amount. And so that's kind of what I marinated in, is this feeling of, with my mom, just like accepting whatever scraps of love I could get. And with my dad, kind of, managing his very grown up problems. And so when I went out into the world and started having relationships of my own, and I don't just mean romantic relationships, though that is generally where this stuff like comes out to play, but even friendships, like a lot of the time they weren't balanced. It was a lot of like me giving and trying and doing and showing like how amazing I could be, how generous I could be, how there I could be, because I didn't want to be left, and because I thought this is like what I do. This is my role, is to be a giver and to keep showing up and to not ask for anything. I really learned as a kid, like, like swallow your rage, swallow your sadness, swallow your grief. It's okay to express joy. It's okay but don't be too excited. Like, don't be too loud, but like, you can be happy, you can be joyful, you can be serious, but don't be sad around me and don't be angry around me. That was kind of the vibe. And that's a pretty limited like menu of emotions you're allowed to have or express. And so I kind of learned to just shove everything else down. And two things happen. One, eventually you start to have no idea how you feel, because you're intentionally cutting yourself off from your emotions. So I'm just going to 20, but when I was like very anxious and depressed. No surprise, so you're taking all that big feeling and just like, wow, pushing it down. It takes so much energy to push all that stuff down. You're not going to have much left to live your life, which is why a lot of the time that's like the source of depression, is just pushing everything down and feeling exhausted. It's like going to the ocean and trying to hold back the waves. This is not going to work, but not long term. I mean, it's not going to work at all, but you might be able to cope that way for a while. So I went out into the world, and I just had this real sense of like, it's not okay to express your needs. I didn't even know what my needs were. I didn't even know like what lit me up or what was fun for me, what excited me, what was interesting. I didn't know any of that. And I ended up in relationships with people, not surprisingly, who were really good at taking, like really, really good at that. And it was kind of like, oh, I love to think about myself, and you're willing to think about me. This is awesome. And so I had a couple, my first just disastrous, painful relationship happened when I was 17 to 20 with a man who was 20 years older. And it couldn't have been worse. I mean, he was kind of like, if you put my parents in a blender, out would pop this person. He just was emotionally distant, very critical, so busy. I mean, he was busy from 6 a.m. to midnight. He owned a bunch of restaurants in New York City. And so like, talk about taking scraps of love. And he was just as unfaithful as my dad. So it's just like a real mind, what. I'm not one to shy away from F-bombs in my life, but I never know who else might be listening in your world. So, it was tough. And that relationship almost did me in. I just barely made it out with my life. I just didn't have and I have a real, I have a very different perspective on, a 40-year-old person going after a 20-year-old person than I did when I was 20. Because I've like lived through it as the 20-year-old, and it's really not okay. It's just not okay. You're at two different stages of life, and you, as the older person, are robbing this younger person of experiences they need to have in order to grow and figure out who they are. So I do have a very different feeling about it than I did at that time. But aside from that, what happened is, in that experience and in future I did not. Most people, when they enter a relationship, the first 3 months, very heady stuff, right? I call it like the lust dust. It's like the hormones are raging, everybody's in love, all these things that you put on your vision board, you just project on this person that you really don't know. And then like the dust clears and you start to get to know like, who is this person actually? And what happened for me, a couple of times, certainly in that first relationship I was just talking about, and in a later relationship, is when that desk cleared, and sometimes it took longer than 3 months, but the person, if they became cruel or distant or, I didn't leave. And I didn't leave because I was primed to just kind of like, I'll just take whatever scraps I can get. And if I'm having any feelings about how I'm being treated, I'm going to push those down. That's what I learned to do. So I just, did that. And that is one of the most soul-crushing experiences you can go through, is devaluing your own pain and your own desires and your own needs, and just tolerating love that hurts, and it might not even be love. It's like sometimes, you're with someone who genuinely isn't capable of actually really loving anyone else because they are their primary concern. And so they'll love you as long as you're loving them and making their life good and not, causing any problems and just like increasing their, I'm amazing quotient. But the minute you start to be a human being with your own needs or your own questions or your own, confusion, you're not going to get anywhere. Like you're not going to get you're not going to get heard or understood, or that's just not going to happen in some situations, depending on what we're talking about. But there are definitely people out there who kind of lack empathy and are just really not interested in how the other person is feeling, unless they're expressing like gratitude or whatever. So if you are someone who grew up feeling that unrequited feeling, or feeling not good enough, or feeling like you had to earn love or chase love, or it was extremely conditional, or there was something like broken in you that the people around you weren't loving you, because you don't want to, as a kid, you don't want to imagine that these godlike people who are taking care of you and supposed to, you don't want to think to yourself there's something wrong with them, or there's something missing in them, or there's something deficient about them. Children tend to be incredibly loyal to their parents no matter what kind of treatment they're getting. And it's heartbreaking. Sometimes you've got a kid who's being abused, but they're loyal to their parents because that's not just the source of their life. I do remember like what's flooding my mind right now is my mom and my stepdad opened a restaurant when I was 8, and I'm not going to go into it too much, but like she always wanted me to try more adventurous food. I was a very plain eater as a kid, and one night she forced a piece of like spicy chicken in my mouth, and I went running through the dining room and down the stairs and into the bathroom and spit it out. And she was chasing me down the stairs, and we got into the ladies' room, and she kind of picked me up by my wrist and she was spanking me, and this woman walked in. And my mom instantly let go of my arm and like went into one of the stalls. And this woman, she was older, she was lovely, she was like extremely kind, said to me, "Are you okay?" Because I was crying. And I remember feeling incredibly loyal to my mother, and I said to this woman, like, it's my fault. Like I did something bad. Like it's not her fault, it's my fault. And she said to me, it's never your fault. Like nobody should be hitting you. It's not your fault, And I just, and my mother was quiet in the stall, and that woman went into the stall, and then she told my mother she was going to call the police. I mean, it was like scary. She didn't, nothing ever happened, but I was worrying about my mother. I was worried that like this woman was going to call the police on my mother. I was crying and begging her, like, please don't call the police, like, So that's what happens. You're just wired to be loyal to those people and to want to, not consciously, but it's like you'd rather take the hit and, imagine, it's more natural to imagine there's something wrong with me than there's something missing in them. And so that also goes on for the first, till you kind of grow up a little bit and you have autonomy and you look around the world and you're thinking about things in different ways and you can see your parents more clearly as the human beings they are instead of these godlike creatures that they seem like when you're tiny. It seems like they have all the answers. Certainly they're the ones, providing the shelter and food and, and so that's what happened. And so I basically was having these disastrous, painful relationships and not leaving. And I remember, having like really great girlfriends. I've always been so blessed with like great women in my life. And I'm sure you have this too. And I've certainly had it in reverse, where you're looking at someone in your life and you're thinking, this person is so amazing, male or female, right? This happens to everyone. Regardless of gender, however people identify, right? Like everyone finds themselves in relationships sometimes where they are tolerating treatment that they never would have imagined they would tolerate. So what's happening? Like, why is that, right? And it can be really, really smart people who are great, great people, loving, giving, fun, kind, wonderful people. And you're like on the outside of it going, why is this person not leaving? And it's because they're stuck. There's something in the dynamic that either feels like home, they're playing something out, or there's something in them that doubts their own worth, their own value, their own lovability. There's something going on there that's deep rooted, and that's the stuff that you really have to get at if you want to liberate yourself, so that those ideas are not running your show anymore. And so that if someone mistreats you, you're gonna leave. Well, it took me a while, to like work that out. And part of it was certainly therapy. And I worked with some really great therapists and some really not great therapists. So it's not like, it's like anything in life. You've got to like really make sure that you're vetting and trusting your gut on things. But also writing and reading and journaling and yoga for me. That was like a big turning point in my life, because what happened for me with therapy is I was very able to identify what my things were, like abandonment. I was like, oh, okay, I could tell you even at 20, I could have told you, well, I have major abandonment issues because like my whole life exploded when I was 4, and I ended up on a farm with like people I didn't know. So, I mean, I could tell you that then, but that's as far as I got. Like, I was like, okay, so I have really big abandonment issues. I guess I'm stuck with that for life. That sucks. You're not stuck. That's the part for me that was really life-giving, was when I needed to get into my body. And you might be like that too. If you're a really cerebral person, you might get really great at identifying what your triggers are, what your issues are, why you feel the way you feel, why you doubt your worth, why you don't think you're lovable. Like, you might get great at kind of breaking all that down and telling someone. But for me, I'm like, I don't just want to be able to like identify what's going on. I want to move through it. I don't want to be ruled by stuff that happened when I was 4 for the rest of my life. And so for me, and I'm not a zealot, people can figure it out on their own and find their own sort of like path forward or tools that work. But for me, I absolutely needed to get into my body and out of my head and kind of work through it. And so one of the things that happened once I started practicing yoga, and one of the things that I think is so great about it, is that you're breathing deeply and you're focusing on your breath. And so it brings you into the present. And you're also focusing on sensation as you're moving, from moment to moment and pose to pose. You're focusing on like, how does that shape feel in my body and what's happening? And sometimes how you do anything is how you do everything. If you have a really loud, nasty voice inside your head, it's going to show up with you. Whatever it is that you're doing, it's going to show up with you. And so then you have an opportunity when things are quiet, you aren't distracted, to like really say, oh, wait a minute, that's a really unkind thought. I don't think I want to believe that. I don't think that thought is true. I'm going to reject that thought and I'm going to try to replace it with a much kinder thought, And sometimes that inner voice it's kind of like made up of the things that you started to believe as a kid that got kind of like stuck in there. And that's the stuff that you've really got to, you gotta start to erode and figure out, okay, now that I'm like grown and I'm the grown up in charge now, what do I think about who I am? And we all have stuff to work on. No one's perfect, like we all have things to work on. So it's not about like trying to absolve yourself or, oh, I'm gonna just blame everything on my parents or my early childhood experience. It's like, no, once you know what those things are, now they're your responsibility to figure out and to work through. So you aren't then taking that pain and turning it outward, and other people are suffering because you haven't done the healing yourself internally. And that's the part that I get really excited about. And even today, if I do have, and I'm going to say it's really uncommon for me at this point, but I'm 52 and I've been practicing for 30 years. So, I can almost always celebrate for other people. Like if somebody has a win, I'm usually the person sharing the win, because it's like, why? Like it feels so much better, and why not? Like that's it just feels much better to be celebrating people, and it also like makes you get into that mindset of like there's plenty there's plenty for everyone. Just everybody keep doing your work and expressing yourself, and trust that the right people are going to find or they're going to find you, and whatever it is that you have to say or share, they're going to find you. You don't have to worry about it. Like it's so I that is not a real struggle for me at this point. But I do have those days, absolutely, or those mornings or whatever, where like might be scrolling, and if I have like an icky thought, like where I'm not being generous or kind or not celebrating a win for someone, I know that I need to stop what I'm doing and figure out, okay, what's going on? Like, why am I feeling less than, or is that little kid in me needing some attention? And I do think, and I was talking about this in last week's podcast, I don't think of time as linear. And this is part of what I was trying to say. I don't know if I got it across in all the ways that I wanted to, but it's like, I really do think that each one of us still has those little kid versions of ourselves alive and well in here, along with all the other versions. Like you keep evolving and changing every day and growing, but you can go back in time to any point really, and think about where you were then. And I tend to think that when I'm struggling, or I'm battling self-doubt, or I'm being hypercritical, that the little kid version of me needs my attention, needs me to kind of check in and be like, okay, what's going on? What's happening right now? Like, what are you actually worried about right now? Like, what is the real fear here? Let's just get quiet and figure out what's happening. And taking that time and getting in the habit, it's a muscle, right? It's a muscle like every other muscle, like just to get into the habit of getting quiet for a minute and trying to figure out, okay, what's off in my frequency right now? Or what is that scared kid version of me, like what's going on with her, and what does she need right now to feel reassured and to feel, relaxed and happy and safe? And that's usually what's happening. Like if we're worrying about something, we're feeling threatened, anxious, and it could be anything, but it's like taking that time because worry, as we all know, it doesn't change anything. It doesn't change the outcome. It doesn't fix anything or solve anything or make anything better. It just raises your blood pressure and makes things in the moment worse. And so being able to identify, like, what's the real fear here? Is the real fear that I'm like not enough, or it's never going to happen for me, or like and you keep asking yourself till you get to the real thing. It's not like, sometimes it's not the surface thing, the first answer, but if you keep sort of asking yourself, okay, and what's the fear underneath that, and maybe you're going to get like the fears, like I'm never going to achieve the things that I'm really trying to achieve. Okay, well then sit with that for a minute, or several minutes. Just like let yourself feel that feeling. It's okay. It's human. It's a human feeling. And that is how you kind of grow in self-compassion and patience, and liberate yourself from that like scraped knee version of you that might occasionally come to the surface. And I do find that tends to happen for me if I'm exhausted, or if I'm dealing with something painful in my life already. It's that moment of like, I don't know, like some small thing happens and you're just like, oh, that's it, And actually, I had a moment like that the other day. I have been doing, for whatever reason, it's like all the adulting things just kind of came, like I've had to do multiple insane amounts of dealing with like Social Security office, the DMV, FAFSA, my kids going to college, like all this stuff, and then I'm making apps, and like Google needs all this security. I mean, it's just been like forms and documents and social security numbers, and please upload your driver's license. Oh, can't read it. It's just stuff like that. And I had a moment the other day where I just was like, like there's nothing wrong with this upload. Where you're like really angry with an inanimate object. I was like really frustrated, and I just let myself be frustrated, like, and and then I started laughing because it's like, it's gonna be fine, and you just upload it again or take another picture of your driver's license, like it's all fine. But I needed to let myself have the moment, and I do think that's part of something like in the wellness world, which I've been a part of for 30 years. I can't tell you how many teachers they shy away from really just natural, normal emotion like anger, rage, frustration. It's like, no, you're a human being. It's not like you're gonna not feel those things. It's what do you do with those emotions? And I think in our culture, there's just way too much editing. And if you think about little kids who are secure, who are in a secure environment where it's safe for them to express themselves, the emotional lability, right? Like I remember when my kids were little, it could just go from like one end of the spectrum to the other in seconds. They could be like the happiest ever, and then like 2 minutes later, like in massive tears over, like, have you seen those blogs, like, why is your toddler crying? And it's like, oh, because their sleeve is touching their wrist, or because like the peas are touching the carrots, like, they're really funny and they're true. But that's kind of the beauty of kids, if they feel secure to express themselves fully, is they're going to just be all over, the map of emotions. And that's obviously, you don't want to like throw yourself down on like aisle 5 at the supermarket if your like favorite peanut butter isn't in stock, but probably be healthier to edit a lot less than we do. You want to be able to self-regulate. That's a skill that I think all human beings, adult human beings, and you start working on it when you're a kid, like just being able to self-soothe and sit with difficult emotion. I was talking about my mom, like she just wasn't someone who ever did that, and instead she drank, and she drank almost every night. I mean, it's very, very rare that she didn't drink, and it's because I think she was dealing with all that, painful stuff that she wasn't expressing in any way. It's not, you gotta let this stuff out somehow or another. Find some mode of expression for yourself so that you're not bottling things up. And also not to feel like, it's so easy because culturally we're not encouraged to share when we're feeling down, or we're feeling scared, or we're feeling confused. People tend to just share the good stuff, right? And filter everything. You can feel really alone, like everyone else is okay and I'm not. Everyone else is probably not okay. The world is, it's like if you're always okay right now, then you're not paying attention. There's just a lot of heartbreaking, devastating things happening in the world right now, and it's sane to feel despair. It's sane to feel rage. It's sane to feel like things are insane. Like those are all sane, normal, natural feelings in the context of what we're living through. And being able to express that and also rest when you need to is, I think, more important now almost than ever. And be kind to yourself and be compassionate with yourself and patient. and acknowledge that there's probably a really scared little kid version inside of you that is sometimes like rattling the cage, like looking for that attention, and to try to give that to yourself. That's where the self-soothing is going to happen, and the self-regulation and the ability to like have a moment of frustration without, having your blood pressure skyrocket, or without having to go to bed for the day. Just to give yourself a small rest, a small check-in, the ability to breathe deeply, the ability to just kind of like sit with it and let yourself feel whatever you're feeling, without editing it away, is, I think, a key part of healing and feeling good. So, yeah, that's been some of my, I would say, most freeing healing work that I've done personally, is getting in touch with those younger versions of myself, even my 13-year-old self, my 17-year-old self, my 20-year-old self, that young adult version of me who thought like I wasn't worth more than that, and I've talked about that sort of like desire to time travel. There are a few moments in my life that I wish I could go back to as a 52-year-old woman and go grab my 20-year-old self and say, like, we're getting the, what, out of here. Get your stuff and let's go. Like, this is not it, But I wouldn't probably want to change the timeline, because, like, I like where I ended up. I love where I ended up. So, it's sad. Like, I have compassion for those younger versions of myself. And I think if you can get into that space, just creates a much more forgiving inner environment where you're like, you are compassionate toward yourself. And if you made mistakes, welcome to the human race. And if you made choices that you would like certainly do differently if you had them to do over again, welcome to the human race. And if you can just kind of be comfortable in your whole human experience, it's really freeing. It's really freeing. And the older I get, the less I worry about any of that. It's like, those are things that happened. They made me who I am. They taught me lessons I needed to understand, and I can go back and comfort those younger versions of myself and root them on when I need to, because they're still in here somewhere. So I hope this has been helpful. And certainly if you have any questions or comments, I love that stuff. Like I said very early in this talk, I'm fascinated by people, and I never want anyone to feel alone. I know that might sound, I feel like everyone, that's like a very universal experience of feeling alone sometimes, and it breaks my heart, and I've certainly been there. So, you can I'm pretty easy to find, and if there's anything that you want to share, I always read the comments, I always respond. So to know that, and thank you so much for joining me for this talk.